Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Grind. For those of you who don't know, this series was filmed before lockdown, before quarantine, before COVID-19 had the state of the world economy in shambles. And so what's been so interesting for me has been going back and reviewing footage of conversations that I had with thought leaders and entrepreneurs, change makers in their respective disciplines, and juxtaposing those conversations and the themes of such with the state of the world today. With today's guest, how I wish I could go back in time and ask him what his thoughts are on the fact that so many people have been expressing an interest on medicinal psychedelics. But first, let me walk it back. Today's guest is Trevor Millar, and he is a social entrepreneur with a rich and diverse career history in various fields, including blockchain technology, corporate hospitality, and over the last 10 years, medicinal psychedelics. He is the owner of Liberty Root Therapy, an alternative addiction recovery center in Vancouver, BC, which includes a program that specifically serves clients in the Downtown Eastside. If you're unaware, Vancouver's Downtown Eastside is the poorest and most addiction-stricken neighborhood in Canada and perhaps even in all of North America. Liberty Root uses ibogaine in its treatment protocol, something Trevor will expand on later in this episode. Ibogaine is derived from the African plant iboga, which has been shown to be an effective addiction interrupter due to its psychedelic properties. Trevor also sits on the board of MAPS Canada, which is short for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He is wholly dedicated to the mission of advancing the research on psychedelics and promoting its medicinal application for otherwise difficult to treat conditions such as depression, PTSD, and addiction. Trevor has worked closely with a number of thought leaders in this space and has a wealth of knowledge and expertise in the area himself. So with that said, please join me for an eye-opening episode of Behind the Grind. If you're joining us on YouTube, feel free to refer to the timestamps below to skip ahead to specific sections of this interview that might interest you. Although I do hope you join us for the entire interview, especially if you are interested in medicinal psychedelics and the future of such in our lives. With that said, welcome Trevor Millar to the show. Nice having you.
Thanks for having me.
So, can you tell me about how you first got started in the psychedelics research community?
For sure. Well, the research community I was invited into because of my work with psychedelics in a therapeutic capacity. And that came about through my work with my company, Liberty Root, where we provided a plant medicine called ibogaine to mostly people with opioid use disorder. Mm-hmm. It's a very effective anti-addictive medicine. And so I had a business that I did that for 4 years, and then for 5 years actually. And then through the course of me operating that business, I became associated and a friend of Mark Hayden, who is the executive director of MAPS Canada. Mm-hmm. And MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Mm-hmm. And they really have maybe arguably done more to advance the legitimization of psychedelics as medicines more than any other organization. So that's MAPS USA, was founded by Rick Doblin in 1986, and MAPS has pushed MDMA through the drug development process. So it has gone through phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, FDA-approved clinical trials. It was so successful in the phase 2 clinical trial that for phase 3, it has been given breakthrough therapy status, so MDMA to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. Mm-hmm. And so that's very exciting. MDMA should most likely be a prescription within 3 or 4 years. And then MAPS Canada was started by Mark Hayden, and it is essentially the Canadian arm of that, and has helped to kind of help the Canadian sites for the phase 2 and 3 trials for MDMA, and now it's starting to do its own research, and Mark does his own publishing and is a great advocate for psychedelic therapy as well.
That's cool. Yeah. Now, wasn't MDMA used in talk therapy to assist, the therapeutic process, the traditional therapeutic process in the 80s or something like that?
So that's, Rick Doblin was aware of that, and perhaps as a therapist used MDMA himself in the early 80s, and it was kind of seen as what it is, which is an empathogen. It seems to open up people's hearts and allows them to dive deeper into some therapeutic processes than they maybe normally would. And when the DEA started looking at MDMA as, something to put on the dangerous drugs list, because kids started partying with it, the rave culture had developed, and there was backlash against MDMA for that. That's when Rick started MAPS to try and make sure that he could protect MDMA as a therapeutic. In fact, he took the DEA to court twice, and he actually won. He made a case for MDMA as a therapeutic, but the DEA just essentially ignored the court's order and still made it illegal, a Schedule I drug.
Right. So before we started taping, you were telling me about ibogaine, and I didn't know actually that Liberty Root you closed in 2017. So when did the laws around ibogaine change? And also, can you also quickly tell the listeners what ibogaine is?
For sure. So ibogaine is a plant medicine that comes from a plant called iboga, and iboga has been used ceremonially for centuries in Africa. It has been used by the Bwiti tradition, who use it for initiation rites and healing of all sorts. And in the early 60s, 1962, in New York City, there was a gentleman by the name of Howard Lotsoff, and his chemist buddy kind of knew that he would try anything. And he said, here, why don't you try this ibogaine stuff? And ibogaine is just one particular molecule pulled out of that iboga plant. And he said, sure. And he took this ibogaine, and apparently it was on the way to his psychologist. And he spent the next couple days on his psychologist's couch, because ibogaine is a very powerful psychedelic. It puts people on about a 36-hour-long journey. And Howard, when he came out the other end of this journey, he realized, wait a second, I haven't wanted heroin the whole time I've been on this, nor do I want it now. So that's when its anti-addictive properties were discovered. And he was a real champion for the medicine. He started knocking on people's doors, trying to get them to pay attention for what he felt he discovered was essentially a cure for addiction. And enough people answered so that a community did develop. Ibogaine was made illegal in the States in the early 1970s, kind of at the time that all the other psychedelics were. And clinics popped up in Mexico where it is not regulated. Small clinics popped up all over the world. And then in Canada, ibogaine was listed as a natural health product when I first started working with it, which was on a professional level about 2012. And while it was a natural health product, Health Canada knew what I was doing. We'd had conversations with Health Canada. And then in May of 2017, they put ibogaine onto the prescription drug list, which is actually a good place for it, because ibogaine is potentially dangerous, and natural health products should not be potentially dangerous. So yeah, kind of coincidentally, in April of 2017 is when I decided I needed a bit of a break from administering this medicine anyway. So I kind of packed up my stuff, and then just the next month they changed the scheduling of it. So I haven't been working too actively with it for the last couple of years. Although I think Liberty Root is still active. I do some consulting business. It's just not, we aren't bringing in patients the same way we used to.
Right. So it was a matter of luck that they ended up changing the scheduling, and then you'd gotten out a month
before. So I didn't have a $5,000 rent that I needed to keep paying when all of a sudden it would have been illegitimate for me to work with it. So the 4 years that you were operating Liberty Root, what kind of work were you doing? What did it look like? How many, clients did you serve? So we treated about 200 people. And we started in a 3-bedroom townhome in White Rock, which is just south of Vancouver. And we would bring people in for 7 days at a time when we first opened up. And as we kind of matured, we realized 10 days is better. So we would bring people in for 10 days at a time. We treated about 75 people through that first location, one or two people at a time. And then we graduated to a larger mansion. It was 6,500 square feet, and we could bring 3 people in at a time. But it's somewhat medicalized. We had doctors and nurses working with us, and the whole process is essentially we worked with people with opioid use disorder. Ibogaine is very good for interrupting all addictions, kind of any negative pattern that you've got going. It's very good at interrupting those addictions. I won't say all addictions. There's some things like benzodiazepine, for example. It's not great at interrupting those patterns. But we would bring people in. We had a doctor that would work with us, so she would prescribe what we needed. So if somebody was addicted to heroin, for example, we didn't want to rush into giving them ibogaine. We wanted to stabilize them for a couple of days, nor do we want to see them in any kind of physical withdrawals. So she would prescribe morphine. So they would stay on morphine for the first day or two, and then we would give them a small amount of ibogaine on the third day or so, rather than the morphine. And that would take away their withdrawals for most of the day, but because it was just a small dose, the withdrawals would come back. But we'd put them on morphine in the evening, and it would only be about half as much. So we could titrate them down over a couple of days to reduce the amount of opiate that they were on prior to the flood dose, it's called, which is the large dose of ibogaine. And for that, we would bring in a registered nurse, and that's kind of the full 36-hour-long experience, after which the withdrawals don't generally come back and the cravings are interrupted, and it really puts people into almost an opiate-naive state, as if they had never had an opiate before. And then for the last few days of the treatment, they're kind of just like hatchlings, so we're doing what we can to put them back together.
Right. Have you kept in touch with any of your former clients? Are they keeping you posted?
Yeah, plenty of them.
So what are they doing now?
Well, I'll pull out my phone here and read a text from a gentleman who he came in, and he was quite young. He actually had to come in twice, and that does happen sometimes. People do end up relapsing, but because they saw how effective the ibogaine was. Nobody really blames the ibogaine for not working. It's just what they do with it afterwards. So he came in, he ended up coming in for a second treatment, and he just had a newborn baby girl. And I got this text from him in January 18th. It says, "I just want to say thanks again, man. There's something special this time with this newborn. I think it's because I wasn't sober when my son was born. I just feel like I'm going to be a way better father raising a newborn. Not that I'm a good father to my son now, but I could have been much better if I was in this mind state when he was born." So yeah, I hear from a lot of my clients quite often. A lot of these clients have become really good friends, because once you take away these substances that, especially when they're made illicit, it kind of drives a person crazy, and they don't behave in a way that they generally think is good behavior. But once you can help them heal from that, then they're all great people.
And then helping them sort of access the potential that they've always had, that might have at one point been at the risk of being lost. I think that's a really powerful mission. But now, even if you wanted to get back into it, it would be a lot harder for you because of the change in scheduling. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's, I would prefer not to operate underground. I've really done what I can to maintain legitimacy. If I really wanted to, I could get my hands on ibogaine, I'm sure, and do treatments for people. But I'm happy that I'm working with MAPS Canada, because MAPS overall is looking at developing ibogaine as a prescription drug. There are numerous parties out there these days that are trying to advance ibogaine is a prescription drug. So fingers crossed one day that it is a prescription. Fingers crossed again to hope that one day it's even covered by the Canadian medical system, as an example, because it would be a heck of a lot cheaper than keeping somebody on methadone or Suboxone for the rest of their lives.
Right.
It's the beautiful thing about this medicine is rather than just being an opiate replacement drug like most of the solutions out there right now are, this actually helps somebody get off opiates and no longer require them.
Right. Do you think you could tell us a little bit more about why you think psychedelics work so well in treating addiction as opposed to other methods? What is the most commonly prescribed method for treating addictions? Is it just the detox?
I think kind of the 12-step program and kind of derivatives of the 12-step program are the most common way of treating people, which is abstinence-based. And if you look at meta-studies, so studies of studies, those 12-step programs really don't show much more than a 10% success rate, if that. So something like ibogaine with anywhere from a 40 to 60% success rate, it kind of blows those other addiction statistics out of the water.
Right.
So psychedelics in general, they really help to address the root trauma quite often, and it seems to be that the trauma seems to be the reason why people end up addicted to substances, because of these traumatic and painful feedback loops that people get stuck into. They just want to find a way to self-medicate those feedback loops. And psychedelics seem to have a way in their own way of helping people address those issues. So, for example, maybe something happened when you were a kid and your mom really hurt your feelings somehow or hurt you physically somehow. And then you can take a substance like these, and oftentimes people will go back and re-experience those traumatic events, but maybe from a third-person perspective, and they can see it in a different way. And you can be like, oh, I can see mom was actually having a bad day there. Oh, mom was having a bad week, a bad year.
Right.
And through that greater insight, a forgiveness process happens and say, actually, I don't have to hold mom completely responsible for that anymore. And as soon as that forgiveness process happens, the slate gets wiped clean, and then that traumatic feedback loop doesn't play in the way it used to.
Right.
Ibogaine itself does something to address the opioid receptor specifically. So normally if somebody gets physically addicted to opioids, it's not like other substances that you get addicted to. When you're addicted to opioids, your body's own pain-killing mechanisms shut down. So when that pain-killing mechanism is shut down and then you take away the opioid, there's a certain pain that gravity, brings to your life. My leg's falling asleep right here. So imagine if I didn't have my natural endorphins kicking in to help that process, I would be in a lot of pain. And that's what happens to people when you pull out those opioids. Just the pain of living is unbearable. And they know that all it's going to take is one more hit and that pain will go away for a few minutes. So ibogaine is remarkable in that it seems to kind of scrub that opioid receptor, bring it back to an opiate naive state so that they don't have to go through that painful withdrawal process.
Right. Have you ever tried EMDR? I don't even... EMDR?
Yeah.
Eye movement desensitization.
Yeah, it seems to be quite effective as well. It's another modality.
As you were describing what ibogaine or psychedelics can do in treating addiction and how it sort of brings you outside of yourself so that you can sort of reprocess the traumatic memories of the past. That process to me sounded very similar to what EMDR does to you, for you. So I've done a few sessions of EMDR, and my therapist gets me to close my eyes and picture the traumatic memory that I want to rework, because traumatic memories aren't processed in the same way as regular memories. That's why you feel in your body sort of the sensations of it. If it hasn't been properly processed, it's a reason. It explains CPTSD, especially if you just had a series of traumatic events happen to you. There's no one thing, And I would imagine, so my issue with EMDR, even though I love it and it's worked for me, the sessions that I've, done it really takes me, it calls for me to have to recall all of the traumatic memories that I've had. And that can be difficult if it's not just one. Which is one of the reasons why, like I told you before this interview, that I am experimenting with microdosing on psilocybin, and it's been the only thing that's really been transformative in my life. And it's one of the reasons why I asked you to come here to chat with my listeners, is because this is an area of interest for a lot of people right now. They have a lot of questions about it. And I think it's not just the implications of this conversation. Obviously, they don't just pertain to the most marginalized populations, but I think everybody can relate to the experience of trauma in one way or another. Everybody can relate to being addicted to something in one way or another. Like Gabor Mate, his talk about, in his TED Talk, The Power of Addiction and the Addiction of Power, he compares himself to a heroin addict, even though his drug of choice isn't heroin, it's consumerism, etc. But that way of looking at it, and then on the flip side, the solutions to it, I don't know. I think it resonates a lot with me.
Well, you mentioned Gabor. His next book, he's a friend of mine. His next book is going to be called The Myth of Normal, because it kind of addresses that. Like, while, people on the Downtown Eastside out here might be more visibly suffering and more obviously struck by poverty, Thoreau, more than 100 years ago, said most people live lives of quiet desperation. And, even the medical literature and research literature, they refer to some people as healthy normals, which would be kind of your average person. But is anybody really healthy and normal in this world? The more I get to know people, the more, even very high functioning, especially as I start working more in the medical field and working with lawyers and in the realm of people that society really look up to, those people are really suffering as well. There's a lot of underlying trauma from trying to succeed in this world.
Right.
And these medicines, I always say that good psychedelic psychotherapy is, it's like as we live life, we're seeing life through a filter, like a pane of glass. And as things happen to us, as our heart gets broken, as we suffer traumas, as, whatever, as we get bullied in school, who knows, that glass gets dirty. And it gets so dirty that we don't even recognize that it's dirty anymore. And for me, good psychedelic psychotherapy, it's not like these medicines add anything to you. It's just that they clean that glass from the inside out. And once that filter's cleaned, once we're seeing the world properly, then we're like, oh, actually, life is awesome. I feel great. I am actually capable. I can make things happen in the world. So I think, there is a myth of normalcy out there, and I think more and more people are waking up to that, thankfully. When I started in this world and I would talk about the fact that we need healing, a lot of people would deny the fact that they needed any healing at all. And yet I see these kind of compulsive behaviors in their own lives. And I think more and more people are kind of humbly admitting that, the world itself and the people in it need a lot of healing before we can even say that any of us are at that level of normal.
Right. It really frustrates me that this area isn't more developed, and any advances that have been made right now, it seems to be halted because there are various interests sort of that at play here, and some of them might be misinformed. What's the path to legalization for medicinal psychedelics?
Yeah, well, Unfortunately, prohibition is in place, and anybody that looks at prohibition with kind of a critical eye can see that it doesn't work. It never has worked. The opioid crisis that we're facing right now is a crisis just because of the prohibition side of things. If people had good, clean opiates that they knew how much they were taking, we wouldn't have people dying off in the mass numbers that we've got. So I think first we have to realize that prohibition doesn't make our communities safer. It doesn't keep people off drugs. Prohibition itself is an abject failure. So ultimately, if we could just get rid of all of that, that would be wonderful. A couple of paths forward that are being taken on parallel tracks is MAPS and MAPS Canada, and the research community is trying to turn these into medicines. And that's definitely, I feel like we've almost won that battle. I think MDMA will be a prescription soon. Psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, it will be a prescription soon. It's also got breakthrough therapy status, FDA approved clinical trials for phase 3 for treatment-resistant depression. And then at the same time, we need to address the decriminalization and legalization route as well. Nobody should be going to jail for using these. There are a lot of decriminalization initiatives that have succeeded at the municipal level in the States now. Oakland was the first to decriminalize all plant medicines. Denver had a ballot initiative to decriminalize psilocybin specifically, and Santa Cruz now as well. So it's still illegal at the federal level in the States, but those municipalities have said, we're just going to make this the lowest law enforcement priority for our city. So we had here in Vancouver, there's a gentleman who started a website selling psilocybin microdoses. Mm-hmm. And on this website, he said that he was eventually going to open up a dispensary in Vancouver. So one Vancouver city councillor drafted a motion really against psilocybin specifically. Mm-hmm. And it read like a page out of the failed war on drugs playbook. It was quite comical, actually. It talked about injectable psilocybin, which is not a real thing. It talked about drug cartels making all kinds of money off of mushrooms, which is not a thing. And we set up a website called decriminalizenature.ca, which is up still now. And through this website, people could send an email that we drafted, or they could write their own, to Vancouver city councillors speaking out against the motion. So we had 750 people email those motions or email those emails to Vancouver city councillors. And then we went and spoke at City Hall around this motion on September 11th. And there were about a dozen people who spoke out against it. Nobody spoke in favor of it. There were some people there who had been radically healed by psilocybin, people with cluster headaches who no longer get cluster headaches if they take magic mushrooms at the right time. There was a mycologist speaking there saying that he had seen magic mushrooms growing on City Hall property before. Mm-hmm. So it's not like you can really prohibit things when they grow out of the ground. And we got that motion shot down. And through that process, we saw that we had at least one Vancouver city councillor that was very much on our side. He was very much against this motion. So I spoke to him and we took him for lunch to see if he might be open to sponsoring a decriminalization initiative here in Vancouver. And he is, and we've drafted a motion with the MAPS Canada policy team, which has a couple of really crackerjack lawyers on the team. And I told them, let's just ask for the utopia. What's the perfect motion? If we could get everything we ever asked for, what would it look like? And we'll start there. So we sent that to him. He said, yeah, it's asking for a bit too much. So we're going to pare back that motion a bit. He also says it isn't great timing. We're going to wait a couple of months to present that to City Council. On another tract, I was approached by some people who have been building a petition to take to the federal level. Canada has a really cool process where you can create an e-petition, and all you need are 500 signatures on that petition, and then the petition will be read in the House of Commons, and the and the government has to respond. So we have been working in conjunction with Green Party MP out of Nanaimo, Paul Manley, and we have a draft of a petition to decriminalize all sacred plant medicines, and we will be launching that petition very shortly, within a month. So all your listeners can go to decriminalizenature.ca, leave their email address, and once we launch that petition, they can know. And we'll have a couple thousand signatures out of the gate, but we would love to have more signatures than any e-petition has gotten in history, so that we can show the government that people really care about this. I'm shooting a video next Friday with the gentleman who has produced some of Jason Silva's videos. You can look him up on YouTube. He's got some cool videos speaking about psychedelics and other things. And the gentleman who has produced those, and he's done some work for the movie Fantastic Fungi, he and I have been looking for different ways of working together for a couple of years now. And I approached him with this, and he said, yes, absolutely. So we're going to really do what we can to create a video that has the potential to go viral, to tell people about this petition, because with the conversations that are happening in the States and that have started happening in Canada, I think there's a real chance that we could affect legislature here in Canada and maybe get some laws changed.
Are you taking notes from the cannabis model of how it got decriminalized?
For sure, and the cool thing about cannabis is it really people started paying attention to it when people realized the medicinal benefits. Of course, there's a recreational use to cannabis, and I honor that as well. But the conversation started to change when people really realized that that cannabis was a medicine. And I think that Rick Doblin in particular, in taking psychedelics through the medicalization process, that's his approach, is if we start with the legitimization through the medical approach, and from there the prohibitions should fall away as they have for cannabis.
What would it take for that legitimization to occur? Would you have to fund more research, or do you have a hand in that through MAPS?
I have a hand in fundraising, so if anybody would like to send money to mapscanada.org, please do. We're in the middle of a fundraising campaign right now. I think we were aiming to raise, $50,000 was the initial goal. We've now raised over $200,000, so we've upped the goal to $250,000 now. So there's a lot of good that can be done with that money towards research, absolutely. And if somebody really wants a specific study funded and has an idea for, maybe we've got a MDMA to treat eating disorders study that is underway now, and that was funded because somebody had a real specific interest in eating disorders and wanted to see what we could do to help there. So if there are any kind of donors that are interested in sponsoring specific pet studies, we can make that kind of thing happen as well.
I just kind of boggles my mind that when you said that your new goal is $250,000, in my mind that's not a lot.
That's nothing.
What?
No.
Can't you set your sights higher?
Well, for sure, and we do. Like Rick Doblin has raised tens of millions of dollars in order to take MDMA through the drug development process.
Right.
The sights are set high overall.
With cannabis, was it like a bottom-up approach of legitimization? Was there like a public interest that sort of got
the Liberal government in Canada, they changed their tune as soon as polls started showing that more than 50% of Canadians were in favor of legalization. So as soon as, I think that's another really great thing people can do towards making these drugs more accessible, is kind of share their coming out stories. Like, I honor you for talking about the fact that psilocybin microdosing is working for you. And the more people can share those stories and kind of remove the stigma, like you aren't some drug crazed hippie.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, the more we can remove these stigmas, and there was a great campaign that happened on February 20th and is ongoing called #ThankYouPlantMedicine. And a lot of people have been sharing their kind of coming out stories on how these medicines have healed them.
What about organizing more of a grassroots approach? So you mentioned the viral video, the potentially viral. How do you plan on making that video shareable anyways? I'm a marketer by trade, so...
Well, for one, I'm working with somebody who has created viral videos before, and he's going to kind of open up all his channels. We've got a lot of networks already set up of people that will share this out of the gate. So I think we do have a lot of, I guess, grassroots support. MAPS Canada has a big volunteer list. A lot of people are looking for ways to help. It's amazing, almost to the person. Once somebody has been helped by these medicines, they want to help other people experience the same kind of transformations. So we've also just recently set up the Canadian Psychedelic Association. So that's a nonprofit that was registered just December 31st of 2019. And I was a part of that, as well as some other really kind of awesome professionals, doctors, naturopathic doctors, psychologists, people who have been operating in the underground with these medicines. And we're really doing what we can to set up an association where it's an umbrella where everybody that's interested in these medicines can come and talk about the best way to have this movement unfold.
Right.
A lot of people are concerned that, cannabis legalization didn't happen in the best way. So how can we take some of the lessons that we've learned from cannabis legalization and steer the movement in maybe a healthier and more holistic direction?
And what do you mean by that?
I think I just mean some of the corporate greed, just looking to make a buck.
Yeah.
I think psychedelics are not the next cannabis in a lot of ways, because cannabis is something that a lot of people do consume on a daily basis. Besides microdosing, psychedelics aren't generally something that people want to consume on a daily basis. I think there's definitely some profit to be made. I think it's just going to take a little bit longer. There's still a lot of legal and regulatory frameworks that we're going to need to hurdle. We're not where cannabis was a year or two ago.
Right.
With psychedelics, I don't think. I think it's got a little bit farther to go in that regard.
I'm sure you know about the positioning of psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, within Silicon Valley circles, and how they're using it to enhance their productivity, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure in that way, some of them aren't using it to address root traumas, but rather to give them an edge. Do you think potentially that sort of elevating that part of the discussion would help legitimize psychedelics?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that at all. I think it's almost like making the well a bit better. And there was an early on study with LSD, for example, where it had to be people who were already quite successful in the world, who had some kind of a problem in their business or life that they were trying to solve. And the whole point of this study was to give people LSD. I think they put on a blindfold and headphones for the first couple hours, and then to take them off and invite people to work on their problems. And most of those people found awesome solutions to their problems. So I think that's just another beautiful way of kind of wedging these medicines into the system and creating legitimacy around them.
I wonder if there's a way to use greed as a tool, not on your part, I'm sure, but like it's a part of human nature is to want more for yourself and to want less of the things that you don't want. Could there be a way to use that as a tool to advance your cause? How do you make people care about what you're working on?
Interesting.
What if they don't want to admit that they have problems that they want to that they have to address.
Yeah, what you just asked reminds me of another part of how my story came about. Is when I was in my early 20s, I started reading lots of books on success, how to be successful, how to make money, things like Tony Robbins, and then that spun into some of the larger spiritual questions, but it was also like quantum mechanics and leadership books. And at one point, I stopped and asked myself, I'm like, well, why am I reading all these books? And the answer came back, well, you want to be happy. And then I kind of asked the question again, well, what do all these books say about being happy? And the answer, after thinking about it for a while, that came back was that the happiest people, or at least the people that I most wanted to emulate, seemed to be helping a hell of a lot more people than I was at the time. And I didn't like that answer. Like, I was very egoic. I didn't see any kind of social work in my future whatsoever, but it was a valid hypothesis. So that kind of led me to looking at how I might be able to help the Downtown Eastside, and everything good has grown out of that. And
where were you in your early 20s? Had you moved to Vancouver?
Yeah, I moved to Whistler in 96, so I think I was 19 then, and then to Vancouver in 2000. I was back to Ontario for a bit, and then 2001. And then, yeah, I started focusing on the Downtown Eastside to see how I might be able to give back there. And then in 2009, ibogaine came on the radar as a way to potentially help. And I've proven that hypothesis true. Like, nothing feels better than getting a text like that. Nothing feels better than actually helping somebody transform their lives. So for those, it's almost like if you take selfishness all the way, then it inevitably becomes altruism, and you end up wanting to give back. So I would invite people who feel inherently greedy to steer that greed in the right direction. Like, how can you take that hunger and turn it towards helping the whole world? Because that will give you the greatest feeling. If you've already got millions and millions of dollars and feel like the next couple of million is finally going to satisfy you, then I've got a blindfold, a playlist, about 5 grams of mushrooms, and a therapist's couch for you that might help you see things a bit clearer.
Right.
Yeah.
If I wanted to learn more about this space, could you give me some book recommendations? And I don't mean to sort of just...
No, that's fine. I think the best one right now, and kind of the most mainstream, and I knew this book was coming out for about a year before it did come out, and had a feeling it was going to be a bit of a tipping point, and I think that it has been. But Michael Pollan's book called How to Change Your Mind, it's an exceptional book about modern psychedelic psychotherapy, and he put himself through a couple of journeys, and he's an incredible author, so that's a very readable book. From the healing perspective, The Healing Journey by Claudio Naranjo is a very good book. Timothy Leary wrote some good books. Another in the therapeutic realm is called The Secret Chief, and The Secret Chief Revealed, I think, is the latest edition. And it's the story of gentleman Leo Zeff, who was working in San Francisco, I think, when he was working with psychedelics legally while he could, and then they were outlawed, and then he decided to keep working with them. And he did over 6,000 sessions. So this book is a conversation between him and a friend of his that really outlines the way to do a therapeutic psychedelic session, and has some very beautiful inspirational stories in there as well.
Awesome. How did you get called to help the residents of the Downtown Eastside? And I know it was out of a desire to help people, but there's so many different ways you could sort of, exercise that desire to help. Why specifically the Downtown Eastside?
Well, I moved from Ontario straight to Whistler. I skied. I was a hotel manager up there, very young, 19 years old, managing one of the hotels up there, which was great. And there was a band that came to Whistler called the Colorifics, and they played a song called Hastings in Maine. And I knew the lead singer, and I went up and spoke to her afterwards. I said, "What was that song, Hastings in Maine?" And she's like, "You don't know the Downtown Eastside? You should go check it out." So the next time I was in town, I drove through, and for anybody that's driven through, it's a very compelling place. You're like, wow, what's going on down here? And I've always had compassion for people who are addicted to things. Like, I was a pretty hard partier and saw that, you know, maybe if I had a lot of traumas that I needed to self-medicate, I would have got stuck in a lot of those compulsive habits. And my mother always warned me about addiction, so I kind of tried to keep things at a distance to a large part. So I had a lot of compassion for people who did get stuck. And then when I moved to Vancouver, I had never put my boots in the ground of the Downtown Eastside, but there used to be a Jeep dealership on 2nd and Main, and I was getting my Jeep fixed there, and I said, I'm going to walk into the Downtown Eastside. So I started walking down Main, and I had this incredible feeling that I was going to see somebody that I knew down there. And it was a horrible feeling because I'm like, oh, the last thing you want to do is see somebody you know down there.
Yeah.
And
what a weird thought.
It was wild because especially when I got there, I saw somebody I knew. It was a guy that I went to high school with back in Kitchener. He was a couple years older than me. Really nice guy, football player. All the girls liked him, all the guys liked him. And even though he was popular, he wasn't a douche, you know, he was a good guy. And he was down there, and he was a social worker. He was helping out under one of the tents, doing needle exchange or something like that. So that's when I thought to myself, maybe I could do something down here as well. And another major factor, as I mentioned, were the books that I was reading and looking at ways that I could give back. But 9/11, September 11th, 2001 was another major factor. And pre-9/11, I would wake up, I would turn on the CTV News Network, I would have that blaring in the background, I would read 3 newspapers a day, I would get pissed off at the state of the world, but wouldn't do anything about it. Then 9/11 happened, and the media started driving me even more crazy. And a couple months after 9/11, I call it an act of grace. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, I realized, wow, this media is really driving me crazy. So I went on a complete media fast. It was kind of pre-internet news, so I just stopped turning on the TV like that every day, stopped reading the newspapers, and then very specifically said, all right, what I'm going to do this. What am I going to do to give back in the meantime? And I just started volunteering on the Downtown Eastside. This basically turned into a 10-year networking and research project. And in 2005, actually, I started a company kind of in desperation to try and raise money, to try and do something. I started printing t-shirts, and I was going to sell those t-shirts and use the profits of the t-shirts to try and give back to the Downtown Eastside. I did print the t-shirts, I did start selling some, and I quickly realized I didn't know what I was going to do with the money anyway. So again, I took a boots to the ground approach. I took somebody out for lunch. I just started walking in the Downtown Eastside. I saw a guy, I said, do you want to go for lunch? I took him for lunch and started asking him questions. What do you think I might do to help out? And he said, you should go speak to Anne Livingston at Vandu. And that's the Vancouver area network of drug users. So I did. I walked into Vandu, and they were having a meeting, and they were the first safe injection site, the first illegitimate safe injection site back in the day. And they're very forward-thinking with harm reduction. They will pay people a small stipend. It was $3 at the time. I think it's $5 now, to come in and do meetings on harm reduction. So, you know, if you're going to use intravenous drugs, here's how you do it in a safe way. If you're going to smoke crack, here's how to do it in a safe way. And that's what I walked in on, was a crack cocaine users group meeting. And I went to the back of the room, and the woman who was facilitating the meeting, she came up to me and said, hey, what are you doing here? And I said, oh, I got this company selling t-shirts, helping the Downtown Eastside. It's going to be awesome. And she goes, okay. So she goes back to the front of the room, and she goes, all right, we're going to have a smoke break, and when we come back, we've got a guest speaker. So there's a bumper sticker that says, the world is changed by those who show up. And I realized the truth of that day. So I kept at it. I spoke to Vandu a few times and said, look, do you even want my help if I can figure out a way to help? And kind of tested the pulse of the neighborhood and got a resounding yes. So I kept at it. And then In 2009, I did finally meet Anne Livingston, and through a conversation with her, which again was just about what can I do to help? And the whole time I was speaking to her, there was a binder on the wall behind her that said ibogaine on it. And near the end of that conversation, I said, what about ibogaine? She goes, actually, I have people calling me for that all the time. And there used to be an ibogaine provider on the Sunshine Coast. It had closed down, but the website was still up, and her name was on there as someone you could contact for additional information. So anytime she got the phone call from then on, she put that call through to me, and I gave it to people right away, not knowing what I was doing. I'm lucky I didn't kill anyone, but I saw quickly that I didn't know what I was doing and backed off, but the phone still kept ringing. I would encourage people to go to Mexico, find a good provider. If you aren't going to do that, here's what I do know about doing it at home alone. Mm-hmm. And then she called me one morning and said, did you know there's an ibogaine providers conference in town? This is Anne Livingston. And I didn't. She said, well, I put your name on the list as a provider. You should go down. So that's where I met the guy who became my business partner when we first opened. He had apprenticed with people in Mexico. He knew how to give the medicine properly. Mm-hmm. And she introduced me to Mark Hayden back when he worked for Vancouver Coastal Health, and he was interested in psychedelics then. So he had me speaking to groups of physicians about it out of the gate. So it's interesting. A lot of those books that I read, and I know your show's about entrepreneurship, a lot of those shows or books that I read early in those days were books like Think and Grow Rich and The Science of Getting Rich, which are essentially books on manifestation. And it says, you don't have to know how you're going to get what you want, but you have to know what you want, and you need to keep moving forward with it. So I think my whole life is a manifestation of the law of attraction. Like, I don't know, had no idea how I was going to do something as audacious as try and help the Downtown Eastside, but I played the long game on it, and 10 years later, Liberty Root was born. And then we were treating people, pro bono clients from the Downtown Eastside with this medicine as well. And I was smart enough to know that you don't want to just pluck somebody out of the Downtown Eastside, give them a medicine like this and drop them back in. Mm-hmm. So we worked with Vandu. I introduced ibogaine to their membership over the course of a week, went to all their meetings, said, if you are interested in doing something like this, you're going to have to show up for a meeting once a week for about 90 days. So we set that up. We had about 15 people at the first meeting. We had maybe 5 or 6 people showing up consistently. But then near the last month, it was clear that we just had one gentleman who kept showing up, who kept jumping through all the hoops we asked him to, was really determined to get off the opiates he was hooked on. Mm-hmm. And we brought him in for a week-long session. It was awesome, went really well. Unfortunately, the housing arrangement that he had set up fell apart shortly thereafter. He ended up in a shelter. He ended up relapsing. But he stayed in touch with us and kept working with us. And he was really open to information on how to change his poverty mindset. And he read books like The Science of Getting Rich and Think and Grow Rich and kept working on himself. We brought him in for another treatment. Long story short is he's now about 2 years sober and has a job that he likes, has an apartment that he likes. And the coolest part was when he called up not long ago and said, I've got $5,000 saved up, and he was looking for investment advice. Mm-hmm. So it was a resounding success, and we're still working through this Canadian Psychedelic Association that we formed. There is a component of that called the Underserved Populations Project, mm-hmm. which is, as all of these medicines are becoming more and more available, how do we set up the context whereby they are going to be made available in a really good way for these people that arguably need them most, whether that's First Nations communities. We have tie-ins with First Nations communities across the country now. I'm speaking to a gentleman in Saskatchewan that's arranging a conference around these medicines, specifically inviting the Indigenous community, and he wants me to MC that, actually. So there's a lot of cool things moving forward in that regard. Is it happening quick enough? Maybe not. Maybe it is, though. Maybe we need some time to figure this out, to make sure that it does happen in a good and safe way.
Do you see yourself going back to operating Liberty Route the way that it was?
I would love to. I don't think it would be the way it was. I think it would be even kind of more robust medically. But my goal with Liberty Route always was that as all of these psychedelic medicines become available, it would provide them all. So ketamine is a psychedelic that is legal. The College of Physicians in British Columbia specifically is kind of frowning upon the off-label use of ketamine, which is this intramuscular way which induces the psychedelic effect but is very good for psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. So maybe one day Liberty Route offers ketamine as a low-hanging fruit. Then as MDMA becomes available, then as psilocybin becomes available, we can offer all these medicines. And then, yes, hopefully, ideally, ibogaine one day as well.
Is there, so the Downtown Eastside really isn't that big, but it's dense. Mm-hmm. Do you tend to know everybody who's involved in trying to uplift that neighborhood? Even if they're not involved in the whole psychedelics research.
I definitely have a bit of a network down there. Yes, I won't name some people, but I know some people who are very networked. Mm-hmm. So everybody's keenly waiting for something like this to become available. I think there are some people microdosing and handing out microdoses on the Downtown Eastside, which seems to be going well from what I hear. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't want to brag about my network, but I don't think it's brag worthy, to be honest. I think there's a lot of other people who know a lot more people and do a lot more good down there, quite frankly. Right.
So I guess my main question, which you sort of answered, is what do they all think about the potential of psychedelics as medicine in this community?
Yeah, the conversation is changing pretty quickly. A lot of people are starting to look at this as an answer. I know one of the doctors within the Portland Hotel Society, I've been for coffee with him a few times, and he's keen to see psychedelics developed as therapy modalities for his patients that he's working with through there. He actually asked me there was a hearing on a detox facility that's going to be built at Clark and First, and he asked me to go speak there on behalf of psychedelics because he'd like some of the research beds there dedicated towards psychedelics. Mm-hmm. So, I think a lot of people's tunes are changing very quickly. I think overall, I feel, as somebody that's kind of been eyeballing the space for the last decade or so, I think we're about 5 years ahead of where I thought we would be at this point, because a lot of people seem to be waking up to the benefits of these.
Right. What's the organization of the Canadian Psychedelic Association?
Yeah. So that's psychedelicAssociation.net.
Okay.
We're accepting people can put their email address in there to stay in the loop right now, but it will be a membership-based organization. I think probably $100 a year to start, kind of thing, and we're going to be offering at least monthly webinars for that $100. But we eventually want to put on conferences. We want to provide policy and regulatory recommendations. We want to be a place where all the researchers can get together, a place where all the doctors can get together, just be that umbrella where everybody can come together and discuss a lot of the unique yet important issues that this realm faces.
And it's something you registered last December?
Yeah.
So what does it look like now? How big is it?
I think we've got maybe 500 email addresses that have been put in there. We haven't promoted it very much at all. This will probably be the biggest promotion I've ever done for it. Yeah, on your show here.
What's its relation to MAPS Canada?
I'm the chair of the board for MAPS Canada. Mark Hayden is the executive director of MAPS. He's completely aware and in support of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. He feels it's a necessary thing. It's interesting, with MAPS Canada being registered as a charity, they can't be politically active.
Okay.
Because any charity in Canada isn't supposed to be politically active, but we're registered as a nonprofit, but without that charitable status, so we can be a bit more politically active.
What are the implications? What are the differences? I didn't know there was a difference between a nonprofit with charity status and one
you can be a
without.
nonprofit and people can give you money but not give you that taxable receipt. But if you're a registered charity and you give money, then you get that receipt that can then be used on your tax returns. And a regular nonprofit doesn't
That must
have
be
that.
so constricting, not being able to be political.
And what does that really mean? Like, Mark Hayden is definitely one of the brightest and best voices for psychedelic therapy overall. Does that affect politics? I'm sure it does. So, yeah, what are the nuances
politics
of that?
versus policy.
Yeah, and he's definitely active in policy. And speaking of policymakers, he said recently there was a meeting at the provincial level with a whole bunch of provincial bureaucrats, and he said the amazing thing was it wasn't a meeting about if psychedelics are going to become a part of mainstream medical system, it was how are we going to make them. So yeah, everybody's, as I've said a few times, the tune is changing very quickly. The war on drugs was a very successful propaganda machine against these substances, but I think many people are seeing through that now at all levels.
So I have one last question for you. And it might be a little bit of a loaded question, but in our conversation so far, I've gotten this overwhelming impression that you are somebody who, obviously this is your passion, and that you have a strong conviction to invest your time in this space because you truly believe in the vision of it all. That conviction has to come from somewhere. And I don't think it's the culmination of just a series of rational decisions that you've made in your life. Like, did something happen to you that led you to this conviction?
Like in a spiritual sense?
Yes.
Almost?
Yes.
My spiritual path, I was raised in the United Church of Canada, which is a Christian church in Canada, probably the most liberal Canadian mainstream church.
Yeah.
They were the first to do gay weddings, first to allow gay ministers.
They had 2 gay moderators back to back.
So super liberal church for sure. And yet and I was involved in that church to the point of when I was a teenager, I was on a pastoral relations committee to help pick a new minister. But in my later teens, there was just some incongruencies in the whole story that Christianity was putting across that made me feel like it was a bit more of a fairy tale. And then I'm like, how do all these adults believe this stuff? And I kind of I almost became atheistic, probably more agnostic, to be honest, but I played a pretty good atheist and really didn't, I probably threw the baby out with the bathwater. And it's interesting, the book I've already mentioned, The Science of Getting Rich, when I was on this incredible thirst for knowledge, I was reading books like crazy in my early 20s. And in that book it says, there is a thinking substance that permeates the interspaces of the universe, and a thought impressed upon that substance brings about the thing thought about. And just the way that hit me that day, I'm like, is this the omnipresent, all-powerful, all-knowing God that my Bible was trying to convince me of? And something in that day, I'm like, maybe I threw out religion too quick. And I didn't immediately look back into Christianity. But I started looking at all the religions I could get my hands on and started looking for the similarities in them all. And sure enough, I saw there's tremendous similarities in them all, which is essentially be a good person. And when I came back to Christianity, my new interpretation of that is Jesus wasn't some dude you put on a pedestal and he didn't ask to be worshipped. He said in his own words, these things I do, you can do and greater. So that really opened up my spiritual path. I started meditating. I started doing things like that. And it's interesting. When you really dive in to the spiritual path, you see that we are all one thing. Like there is multiplicity. We this one thing comes in all different shades and colors, but you can get to a place with meditation and with some of these medicines as well. The first time that I ever smoked 5-MeO DMT was probably again in around 2003. And I had this incredible spiritual experience where I felt this unity. Like all of a sudden I could feel complete awareness of every cell in my body. I could feel every cell in my body aware of me being aware of it. Then that expanded to the whole universe. I felt this incredible unity with the universe, and there was some kind of a presence guiding it that when I said, what does all this mean? This presence replied in its way. It said, it's perfect. You can't mess it up. Even your ideas of imperfection are built upon a perfection that needs to be there before any concepts can take place. So I came out of that experience in particular jumping for joy. In a lot of ways, I haven't stopped jumping for joy. And that experience also seemed to indicate to me that all this spiritual seeking I was doing was to bring me back to that sense, but without the drug, to realize our heritage as this divine, profound thing. And in 2005, before I started the t-shirt company, I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life in Costa Rica. I had made some money. I sold stock options at a good time, had a bunch of money set aside. I went to Costa Rica for 4 months, and I thought it was going to be forever. I am pretty entrepreneurial. I thought I would just start up a business and stay there for good, keep my life simple. But I just smoked a bit of a joint. I'd just been reading a bit of a book. I laid back in this hammock and I experienced this profound sense of unity consciousness again, where I just melted into this sheer perfection. And it was just like, this is exactly where I've always wanted to be. And within that space, something crept in and said, you're not going to be able to really enjoy this until you help more people get here. And I literally packed up 2 weeks later and moved to the Downtown Eastside. I moved into the Belmont student residences at the corner of Hastings and Main. And all I've been doing ever since is trying to get back into that hammock and be able to truly rest, saying, all right, I've got the ball rolling in at least a few good areas, and I feel like I've played my role a little bit more on purpose, and maybe one day I can back off a bit again.
Have you gotten close to that experience again?
Well, I really like Sadhguru. I found him. He's an incredible teacher. I've been in his presence, and I've learned his 21-minute meditation that I do every day. I do yoga every day. And yeah, like I try and start every day by getting to that space. I don't really feel like a seeker anymore. For so much of my spiritual journey, I felt like a hungry seeker looking for whatever it was. Now I feel like I've kind of got that, and it's just about reconnecting with that every day and kind of not buying the bullshit. Like I see horrors and I see people in intense hardship, but if I can maintain that peace through that, then I feel like I bring a lot more power to the equation. And I feel like everything I do is inspired by that sense of unity, and that if anybody is suffering, then in some way I am suffering as well. And if I can do anything to lift any aspect of somebody else's suffering, that makes me feel really good. So, because again, we're all connected. The more I feel good, the more that goodness radiates out to the rest of the world.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's a good note to end off on.
Cool.
So thank you so much for joining us.
Question.
We're going to make sure that all the links, everything that people need to know about what you're working on, are going to be readily accessible.
Perfect.
And also this is something that I personally am really interested in, so I'd be really interested in following along on your updates and so forth. So
great.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.